So we'll go ahead and get started. So I just want to welcome everyone to the Invasive Species in South Carolina webinar, and thanks for joining us today. So we'll be recording this webinar, and all attendee cameras and microphones will be off during this presentation. So feel free to pop your questions in the chat box, and I'll interrupt and we'll ask them at the end of the presentation. And then so with that, I'll introduce myself. I'm Allison Bugarin. I'm the Education and Outreach Manager for South Carolina Wildlife Federation. And for those who aren't familiar with South Carolina Wildlife Federation, we're the oldest conservation organization in the state, and we have been conserving and advocating for wildlife since 1931. I'd like to introduce our speaker today. This is Dr. David Coyle, who's the Associate Professor and State Extension Specialist of Forest Health and Invasive Species for the Department of Forestry and Environmental Conservation at Clemson University. So during this presentation, I'll be assisting with logistics, and as I mentioned, you'll be muted and your cameras will be off. But at the end, we'll have time for questions. So Dr. Coyle, thank you again for joining us, and take it away.
Thank you. Happy to do it. Hello, everyone. I saw someone was getting feedback in there, and I suspect that might be on their end, but you're in charge, not me. So I'll let you handle that, Allison.
Oh.
So we are going to talk today about invasive species. I hope that's why everyone has joined us. Thanks for having me again. I do a lot of stuff with some of the SCWF folks in person. So this is my first webinar. So let's dive right into it. I am based at Clemson. I have statewide responsibilities, and I work kind of across the region, but I am going to focus on things in South Carolina today. Before we start, a disclaimer. I've seen a lot of things. I've been around a while, and I've done this for more years than I care to admit, and I've got some opinions, and I'll let you know when some of these opinions are just that, but a lot of these things I'm going to tell you are going to be straight up fact-based, and I'll give you references for that. So with that being said, what is an invasive species? This is one of the first questions hopefully we get. And before we talk about what an invasive species is, we need to go over some terms. As they say, you've got to eat your salad before you get your steak, right? So terms, what does native mean? What is a native species? It simply means it's from here. And I hope the next question you ask is, what does here mean, Dave? When I think about things biologically, I think on a continental scale. Right. So if something is from North America, that makes it from North America, South America. Insects, plants, fungi, things with backbones that are not humans, nothing sees geopolitical borders like people, right? So if something is in the very northern part of Minnesota and it walks 10 feet into Canada, that doesn't make it an invasive species in Canada. It just means it moved 10 feet because that's what animals do sometimes. So continental scale is what gives us a native thing. Lots of things simply mean it is not from here. Non-native, alien, exotic, non-indigenous. All these just mean this thing is not from here. And from our perspective, we're talking about North America. When you look at the invasive species, though, this is a thin sliver of the non-native things. Think of them as the worst of the worst, right? So if it is invasive, it is not from here. So anyone that tells you sweet gum is invasive, that is not accurate, right? Is sweet gum aggressive? Yes. Is it kind of annoying? Yeah, in some cases. Is it really good at colonizing disturbed areas? Absolutely. But it is a native species and it's doing what it is meant to do. So to be invasive, you are not from here. You cause some sort of measurable damage. Maybe that's ecological, maybe it's economic, maybe it's a human health thing, but it's got to be a measurable type of damage. You displace a native species, meaning you push it out, and there has to be a sustaining population. Think of any of the worst invasive species we're going to talk about today. If the first one that got here was simply a male, then nobody cares because that's not going to make a population of new ones, right? It's got to be something that will make a new population. So what characteristics do invasive species have? Why are they the way that they are? Four main characteristics I tend to think of. It attacks a healthy host. An invasive species is what we call a primary pest. It will attack a host regardless of how healthy it is. When we start talking about emerald ash borer, it does not matter how healthy your ash tree is. If that beetle wants to get in there, it's going to chew its way right in. They have rapid dispersal capabilities, meaning they can spread lots of places really quickly. They have a high reproductive rate, which helps them establish populations fast. And they are typically able to survive a wide range of conditions that can be wet or dry, hot or cold, any of these type of things. So that is what makes an invasive species and what is an invasive species. And how do we get them? The short answer is we buy stuff, right? And this is the shortest of answers you could think of. There's lots of information out there, lots of great data that shows the relationship between the amount of non-native things that get into our country related to the amount of cargo that also comes into that country. So every time you buy something on Amazon, that is cargo that is most likely coming from overseas, right? And there's lots of data out there, whereas you have more stuff coming in, you see more pests as well. And if you look on the global scale, the US imports a lot of stuff, 4.3 trillion in goods in 25. And this map is a kind of a simplified version of where we get things and where we send things as a country. The bigger the arrow, the more the stuff goes. If it's green, we ship it out. And so if you look here, the two big green arrows are going to Canada and Mexico. So we send the most stuff north and south of us. And red means it's coming in. And where is that great big red arrow coming from? Shocker, made in China, right? Lots of things we purchase are made in China for a lot of different reasons. So keep this in mind. We're going to put a little puzzle together, and all of it's going to come together in the end to tell you why we get so many non-native things from China and Asia in general. So we buy stuff gets shipped, it gets inspected by several different entities, and sometimes we find the stuff. And we do find a lot of different things. And by we, I'm talking about APHIS and Customs and Border Protection and Departments of Ag. Like, we find a lot of things. These things are in solid wood packing material, they're in live plants, they're in food. Dogs are used a lot, especially in airports and some of these cargo areas, because it's just got such great sniffers. And then there's all sorts of cases of our professionals finding things that you probably never hear of unless you're like really looking to see some of these press releases. But we find stuff all the time, right? So they do a really good job at what they do. We'll see later. It's just a problem of it's going to be a volume issue, right? So anyway, sometimes we find them, which is great. Sometimes we simply don't find the stuff that comes in. And I mentioned solid wood packing material earlier, and I work a lot with this because most of the things I tend to work with are in woody species, woody pests, right? Solid wood packing material are all of those woody things that just help hold or brace things while they're in transit. So pallets are probably your number one thing that people think of. It's those big bracing boards that go on things. It's those great big spools that have all the wires. And then it's dunnage down there in D. And I said dunnage, and that's a term that not everyone has heard of. Dunnage is simply rough cut timber that is used to stabilize or balance something. It can be these big chunks like this. It can be a bunch of little pieces like this. And for whatever reason, when you look at pallets and spools and all those other sort of put together parts of solid wood packing material, they go through a process to decontaminate them, to make sure they're sterile and not bringing stuff in and out. Dunnage somehow, it's a loophole, right? You could go cut a tree down next to the port, shove it in the bottom of a ship, and it can be used just as dunnage. So it's a really unfortunate thing. This stuff often gets dumped at the port they go to and then maybe scooped up by another ship, taken to some other country. So it just sort of travels the world. And when you think about the pathway of a pallet, right, of solid wood packing material, here's a pallet. It seems like it'd be simple in that you've got a pallet over here, you put something on it, it goes over here, and that's where it is. But it is hardly that. And if you look at the typical pathway for a single pallet, starting with when it's a tree to when it actually gets destroyed, there's about a dozen different places it goes and stops, and a lot of different places where pests can get on it or get off it. So it's a really complicated issue in general to try to stop stuff coming over on solid wood packing material. Couple that with the volume issue. Okay, so this is I just happened to catch this out the window when I was in Savannah a few years ago. This is a moderately sized barge at best. Port of Savannah is one of the top two in the country, especially on the eastern seaboard. Conservatively, my redneck math tells me there's about 3,500 containers on this ship. And just for scale, these little people down there, those are the people, right? Those little orange things. So that's how big this thing is. So think of the volume when you've got stuff coming in 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, all of these containers. And again, each of those containers is pulled by a semi truck. So this is how much stuff is just always coming in. So sometimes we don't find stuff just because there's not enough people to physically look at every single thing that comes in. Sometimes these pests get out and they get away, and sometimes they get established. And here's where it gets tricky, because when you look at what the world looks like in terms of climate and vegetation, you get this map that shows forest vegetation zones. And what you really need to look at here is the colors. The same color is the same general type of environment. So if you look at the Southeast, it is the exact same type of environment as you have in Southeast China. This just simply means it's hot, it's humid, there's lots of pines, lots of oaks, and things are pretty similar. And as you go up the seacoast, you see the same color over here. And then this is also why you have a lot of things from Eurasia, and the Scandinavian countries can sometimes get into Canada, and places in the Southwest that are much drier. They are at a bigger risk for these Mediterranean pests, because if something gets on a ship from one of these areas and gets over here to the States in the right environment, it gets off. It feels like home, except there's no natural enemies that were keeping it in check back where it was. Kind of has a free carte blanche to do its thing. Once pests get here, humans typically inadvertently move them around, right? And there's all sorts of examples. Here's a truck full of firewood, not my truck, just for the record, but we know that bugs can live in firewood for up to 3 years in some cases. Pine straw, super common across the region, of course. And here's a chunk with Japanese climbing fern clinging to it, which can start a new infestation. And then this is on the bottom of its trailer that was going from Indiana to Florida. And these are spongy moth egg masses and adults. Only found because this trailer got a flat tire, and the person that stopped to help them was with the Indiana DNR and noticed this stuff. The homeowner had no clue. They were just set to go down to Florida to visit family, and it was that close to having an invasive species up in the north part of the country moved all the way down to the southern part. So things get moved around, much to our chagrin. Sometimes these things will get established, and just because it gets established doesn't mean it's the worst thing in the world. There's a lot of non-native stuff we'll talk about that it's established that we don't really know what it does. It doesn't do anything measurable. But some of these things do have some big issues. And in that case, we have a situation when you get that non-native thing that gets established that has a lot of impacts, right? Once we've got a situation, people like me, our job now is to figure out what to do. How do you manage it? How do you try to make it not as bad as it already is? We talked about this just a minute ago. Are all non-native things bad? And I think the Cliff Notes version is not that we know, right? I mean, in some cases, we haven't figured out what some of these things are doing yet, but there's a lot of stuff out there that don't cause any significant damage that we know of, and they've been here for years. And this is just an example from some work we did. This is, pushing 25 years ago back down Savannah River site near Aiken, South Carolina. We put a bunch of big log piles out. We captured all the insects that came to them. And what we found was, you've got quite a few native things, but the vast majority were non-native things, right? And of these non-native species, it's a relatively few amount of species in general, but a lot of volume. And some of these things, we don't really know what they do. They're just there, but they've been here for years. So the point of all this introductory stuff is that invasive species are a special little segment of the population of things. There's lots of non-native stuff out there. Just because it's non-native doesn't make it invasive. We have to figure out if it's actually doing something impactful first, and then it can get that qualification. Inspections happen all the time, and the people that do it do a great job. There's just simply not enough people to really adequately inspect all the stuff that comes in, because we are a society that buys stuff and stuff gets shipped in all the time. All that said, let's talk about some of the common invasive species we have here in South Carolina. We'll start with the elm leaf beetle. This thing has been here for a long time. It uses all elm species as hosts, and it can be a bit of a nuisance, especially in the fall and winter months. You see these things out. This does a type of damage called skeletonization, and where the tiny larvae, this one's not so tiny, but when they first hatch, they sort of eat between the leaf veins, and it makes them almost see-through. If you look a little farther back, they've got this brownish bronzed type area, and I tend to think of elm leaf beetle as this is the bug that makes it really easy to see every elm tree in the Piedmont, especially come July or August, because every single one of them basically looks like this every year. Is this damage going to kill trees? Probably not. Trees can handle a full defoliation, especially if it's later in the season like this. It's not going to do a whole lot of damage to that tree's health because they've had time to make food from those leaves and they'll reflush and all this. But we do have elm leaf beetles all over the place, especially the Piedmont gets hit really hard. So as the summer goes on and you see something like this, go check it out. You might be able to see some of these little critters out there. Another beetle we have is the emerald ash borer, and I would argue that this is probably in our lifetime the most detrimental and impactful invasive forest pest we have seen, akin to chestnut blight for the generation ahead of us, or Dutch elm disease. It's almost impossible to know what impact this thing has had altogether. It's been just so much, millions of trees, billions of dollars. Know the host or your ash is toast is kind of one of the mottos, my motto anyway, because these things are only going to affect ash trees, which is fraxinus, and they've got a certain set of characteristics. And I'm telling you this because there's a lot of some folks out there will say, I heard EAB, emerald ash borer, will eat other things too. White fringe tree gets talked about, and olives get talked about. White fringe tree has been found to be a host for emerald ash borer, but that being said, it is only a host. It's been found in Ohio where EAB populations were absolutely sky high and there was nothing else left for it to eat. Here in South Carolina, we don't have that much ash. Okay, we have it in cities, we have it in municipalities. It grows along the wet river bottoms and some of those bottomland hardwoods, but it's not like it is in the Midwest where it's 20-30% of all of our forest. It's 2-3% of what we have. We are very unlikely to see EAB populations in South Carolina ever get to that type of epidemic level. I recommend planting white fringe tree anytime you want because it's probably not going to ever get hit by EAB unless you live maybe in the far upstate where we have it. Throughout the rest of the state, plant the thing. It's a great tree. Olive, yeah, it developed on an olive tree once, but they shoved it in a box and it was the most contained thing you could ever see. And when your option as a bug is to eat this thing that sucks or die, you're probably going to eat the thing. And that's kind of what we have. So yes, people can get, EAB to eat some other things, but realistically, it's only hitting ash trees. Plant a fringe tree, okay? The life cycle for EAB is pretty standard in terms of this type of bug. The adults will come out in, late spring, kind of right when the ash is starting to flush. They will nibble on the leaves, but the damage from the adults it's negligible at best, just nibbling a little bit there. They put these little eggs on the bark, and these things are what do the damage. It's the larvae. Okay, so these larvae can get up to almost 2 inches long. They're feeding on phloem, and you can see these galleries where they just wind their way all through underneath the bark. And what this does is cut off the tree's ability to move nutrients. Okay, so right underneath the bark is called the phloem, and that is where food moves in the tree. And if that is cut off, food can't move, and the tree dies, obviously, right? And then they'll pupate inside there. Here's where we see EAB. It's basically all over the eastern part of the continent. It's in, it's up in those Canadian provinces as well, also out in British Columbia at this point. So it's jumped the Rocky Mountains. It's infested over there in Oregon, and we're just probably going to see it proliferate and go up and down the West Coast at this point. It's tricky to figure out that you have EAB because the first thing that happens is your ash tree just looks sick, right? It looks like it's losing some leaves. The crown thins out. This could be from drought. This could be from injury. This could be from almost anything. So it's tough to say that this is EAB right away until it looks like this. This is what we call epicormic sprouts. This is, as my friend Stephen Pullman said, the soul of the tree escaping, right? So this is the tree's last gasp breath. And at that point, the management for here is real easy. You just cut the thing down and plant something else because a tree that looks like that is not going to be a tree again. Okay. If you look close on that tree, you might see cracked bark, and underneath the bark, you'll see those galleries kind of going back and forth. D-shaped exit holes is what the adult makes every time. It's this perfect D. And then again, you've got these galleries under the bark. And I show you the galleries because in some cases, they will consume every bit of phloem underneath that bark. They're really, really voracious feeders for this type of thing. We also can see ash blonding, which is basically your 70-mile-an-hour going down the road ID when you have an ash tree where the bark all of a sudden looks really, really whitish. That's because you've got birds and squirrels pulling off the bark, trying to get the larvae underneath. To that end, birds are a great identifier, especially woodpeckers, in that your tree is sick, right? Because woodpeckers are going after bugs eating underneath that bark. If you've got an ash tree that's starting to look sketchy and all of a sudden you've got woodpeckers all over it, it does not mean you're a great woodpecker caller or you've got like the best environment for woodpeckers. It means there's some stuff in that tree. And so those are a good indicator that there might be something going on there. You can save an ash tree, and I've been asked, is there anything good about emerald ash borer? And I would say the one thing that this insect forced the industry to do, the tree care industry to do, is make better tree injection techniques. So you can save trees from a lot of stuff now by injecting pesticides into the phloem and into the xylem, and you make them basically bug proof. It can be done. You've got to get them early because the more canopy loss you have, the less chance of it all working. And that's where it gets tricky because these trees along this street are all infested right now. EAB likes to start up at the top and kind of work their way down. These are infested, but they look great. A lot of times by the time you know they're infested, it looks like this. And man, it's really hard to save these things. Okay, so there's emerald ash borer. Right now we've got EAB in, I believe, 6 counties in South Carolina. Most of them are north of 85 in the upstate. The South Carolina Forestry Commission has information on that specifically on their website, but you're looking at an upstate pest at this point. Next, we'll talk about the Asian longhorn beetle. Now, this is on the other end of the state, down there in Charleston, a little bit of Dorchester County, native to Asia, very wide host range. That said, it prefers maples almost exclusively. 98% of what it eats is going to be an acer. You're looking at red maple, and a little bit of silver, and whatever other maples people have planted down there. Pretty good sized beetle. It looks like a lot of other great big long intended bugs to a lot of folks, right? So you've got ALB on the left. You've got some of our native wood borers that you can find occasionally on the rest of it. But these are pretty good size. Think of them as a really shiny black beetle with bright white spots, and the feet actually have a blue tint to them when these things are alive. In terms of cerambycid beetles, or the cerambycity or your longhorn beetles, they're pretty standard as well. So the adult females will chew these little pits in the bark of trees. She typically hangs upside down, chews them, chews these pits, and then these can be up and down the tree, whether it's a larger stuff, smaller stuff. They love things in the like 4 to 10 inch diameter range. They whip around, shove an egg into each one of those pits, and then those eggs will hatch. That's happening basically right now. Eggs have hatched, and you've got larvae feeding on the phloem underneath. And when this happens on a red maple, it tends to bleed sap. So you see this really dark dripping down the tree. In terms of when can you find Asian longhorn beetles, this is a great time of year because this dark sap dripping down the tree really contrasts with the light bark. It makes it pretty easy to see. Another couple months or so, the larvae will turn and go straight into the wood itself, and then they're going to push out sawdust and frass, and that's our fancy term for bug poop. Push all this stuff out, and then this is the larval stage that does a lot of the damage. So here's a larva next to a dime, pretty good size. Some of these things can get, almost pinky size in some cases, and they're going to swish cheese their way throughout the branches and the stem, which, as you can guess, causes these trees to fall apart. You see broken falling branches of fairly substantial size in quite a few cases. Here's one from one of our research plots earlier. So here it is in my hand on the left. And on the right, there's every one of those larval galleries that happen. So as they chew their way through there, it just gets really weak. A big wind comes along and stuff just sort of everything just sort of falls apart. The adults come out with a nice circular exit hole. It's about the diameter of between a pencil to a Sharpie, about a quarter-inch long or so. Where is ALB? So I mentioned we have this in South Carolina. There are 3 other spots in the continental US, in North America, honestly, where this thing's at. We've got some spots in Ohio, and then 2 up in the Northeast. In South Carolina, we've got the main spot kind of around the Hollywood, Ravenel area, and then there's also an infestation over in Mount Pleasant. And I'll give you a website at the end where you can report if you think you have some of these things. We work very closely with our regulatory folks, and we'll provide that at the end here. But this is the area we're talking about. To our knowledge, it is not anywhere else in the state at this point other than these 2 spots down around Charleston. Now, ambrosia beetles. There's lots of ambrosia beetles out there. Several, well over a dozen species established in the U.S., in South Carolina, that are not native to here. These are a couple really, really common ones. We'll talk about 2 that you may have seen. The black twig borer. Now, granted, you probably haven't seen this because it is just the tiniest little thing, but it's got a very wide host range, and it's responsible for branch flagging. So these are most common on the coastal plain, but you also see them getting up into the Piedmont and the upstate as well. This flagging doesn't typically hurt the tree, but it just can be an aesthetic issue for certain. And here's kind of a close-up. This is a magnolia down there just off Highway 17, our Clemson coastal wreck. You see these dead branch ends. Okay, this is kind of a great sign that there's probably black twig borer there. And if you look really close, go from where the dead starts and eventually you get to where there's live, you can see a little teeny tiny hole. This is where that adult beetle bored in. So you can see how small they are. And then she bores up toward the distal end and lays her eggs in there. This kills the end of the branch. Will it hurt the tree as a whole? Probably not at all. But we also know that these things typically like to attack 10 feet lower or less on the tree, which is kind of right where your line of sight is. So it's fairly easy to notice this type of damage. Another ambrosia beetle, which causes a lot more damage, is the red bay ambrosia beetle because it carries laurel wilt. These are 2 things native to Asia. Standard ambrosia beetle life cycle, and you see that picture in the middle. Every one of those little hairs coming out of there, we call it a toothpick or a frass tube or a noodle. Every one of these represents a spot where an ambrosia beetle has drilled in, and as they're drilling into that tree, they're pushing out sawdust and poop and a little bit of fungal mycelium because they're making a gallery in there to have their brood. Every host in the family, or every species in the family Laraceae, is a known host, right? So red bay is probably the most common one we have in South Carolina. There are some sassafras, of course, as you get to the Piedmont and upstate. All of these are hosts. Red bay are most notable because they keep those dead leaves on. And it's sort of you never really knew how much red bay was out there in those coastal plain forests until it was all dead. And it all just looked like this. And then it was a really sad deal because holy cow, there's so much out there. This thing was first found, well over 20 years ago, and it's basically just filling in at this point. So we've got it over most of the eastern part of the state, but also we're seeing it in the upstate as well. All right, suckers. Some of you folks of a certain age are going to get this reference, but we've got a few sucking things that we deal with in terms of invasive bugs here in South Carolina. Spotted lanternfly is our newest one. We found this last year. It is a major pest of fruit trees, vines, and frankly, lots of other stuff. This was in April. You can see the nymphs. This is up in Greenville. We've got a spot up there. They start out black and white, and eventually they develop that reddish color before they turn into the adults, which you can see on the tip of my finger here. So they get to be about a half-inch long or even a little bit longer. Not very good at flying, really active crawlers, really good at jumping, and they spread kind of by crawling up something high and then jumping and flying, and they can cover several hundred yards kind of in a spurt at a time if they so choose. Most of this stuff is up in the mid-Atlantic and Northeast. You can see there's getting to be a lot of spots as you come down our way. It is basically like a great big plant hopper in that it's got the same type of life cycle where these egg masses are laid and then they hatch and then things get bigger, 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 and eventually wings come out of them. So we call this sort of an incomplete metamorphosis. We know that there's over 100 hosts this thing will use. They do love Tree of Heaven. This is one of the places where if you're going to find these things, it's probably going to be on Tree of Heaven first. We know there's lots of impacts. We talked earlier about measurable impacts for these invasive species. Obvious impacts for agriculture, right? There's been a lot of, I mean, look at how many lanternflies are on that apple tree. It's just unbelievable. Every one of them inserting their mouth parts into that tree, sucking the juice and the fluids out of it. But there's also nuisance impacts, right? So this is up, this is up there in the Pennsylvania area. You can see them all over the place. And then speaking of nuisance, when these insects suck the juice out of a tree, what they essentially do is they're siphoning out the nutrients and they're pooping out what is basically sugar water. And when that sugar water falls on whatever's below it, it gets sticky, it's sweet. And so a lot of other insects are attracted to it, especially beetles and wasps and yellow jackets and hornets, which nobody wants to see a whole bunch of these things coming at them. So you've got a lot of impacts from lanternfly, not just on plant growth, but in terms of people, human impacts as well. On to things that don't suck but aren't awesome. We've got an invasive hornet here in South Carolina as well. This is something that's relatively new. The yellow-legged hornet, we only found this, 2.5 years ago or so, coming up on 3 years. I say this is no risk to humans in that it's not going to attack you or go after you. That said, it is a hornet with a stinger. So if you do things you shouldn't do to anything with a stinger, it's probably going to sting you. So while there's no, big issue and big risk to people, it will still sting you. Okay. We have this right down around Savannah, Hilton Head, Charleston. It's in that whole area. So I'll show you, this is kind of your heat map for Georgia. And then if you look just north of that, here's the Charleston, Savannah area. And what we may notice is that, holy cow, look at those 3 spots up there in York County. That's right. We have this not just on the low country now, but as of last year, it has been found up there in York County, probably transported by people. And we talked about that before, and that people inadvertently transport stuff. We can speculate how it got there and all these things, but the fact of the matter is it did not just simply fly up there. It hitched a ride somehow on something, and now we've got some spots up here. So here's the life cycle of the yellow-legged hornet. Okay, so we start out in January where the overwintering queens will do their thing. She will wake up, she will come out of her diapause, she will make what we call sort of an embryo nest in April. It's a little tiny thing, one of the, baseball size or so. This is where she starts her brood. So she starts making some eggs, she starts creating some workers, and then time will pass, right? More workers will come, and then they will make a larger nest. Typically, they will move and make a larger nest. This is a primary nest, is what we call this. Again, this is where brood expansion is happening. So more and more workers are being produced. And then as time passes, eventually in another month or so here, we get to the secondary nests. And these are the great big ones that can house thousands of different workers at a time. And so these are typically placed very high in trees, so their size can be deceiving. I want you to imagine right now how big you think that nest is, because here's how big they actually are. They're massive. They're larger than beach balls in a lot of cases. Okay, so these are all a bunch of nests that they have harvested. This is last year, I believe I got this picture. So the yellow-legged hornet, one of the biggest things it does, the main thing it does, is it attacks honeybees. And some of you may say, well, honeybees aren't native either. Agreed. They're basically cows, right? They're basically pollinating cows. They're an agricultural tool that we use, and it is a significant pest of that agricultural tool. It does this hawking behavior where, if you look carefully, there's a blue arrow there. It will sit outside a honeybee hive and pick off workers as they come in. And so one bee can destroy several workers in a day. It'll grab a worker, take it away, eat it, or maybe, take the legs and the wings off and bring it back to the hive. So it does a lot of damage to individual hives. So this is one of the reasons that there's a lot of effort going into this particular pest. Now we have an invasive spider. As if an invasive hornet wasn't bad enough, there's also the spider. Some of you may know the Joro spider, especially those of you in the Piedmont and upstate, most likely have seen this thing. This has been here coming up on 20 years, maybe 15-ish or so. The life cycle, it overwinters as an egg sac. There's one just way in there, kind of wrapped up in a leaf. You're going to have spiderlings in late April to early May. And here's some from a former student of mine, Beth, who's doing work on this. These were in the lab. Funny story. I walked into the lab one day and she had these just in an open container. And that's all well and good. But I asked her, I said, hey, Beth, do you have a cover for these things? We don't want to be a lab that puts spiders in the whole building. So we had to get that fixed real quick. But you may have heard of the flying Joro spiders that took the news for a while ago. So when spiders are super tiny like this was the end of April, they will put out a silken strand, and if the wind takes it, it just goes. And this is one of those. Beth was out walking her dog, and all of a sudden, one of these little things just landed on her because it had been ballooning, is the term used. So they can spread via ballooning. If you see flying spiders, though, it's not like they have wings. It's not the big ones. It's these teeny, teeny, tiny ones that are just spreading on the wind. After they find a good spot, they will settle down. Here's a little tiny juvenile, and this is kind of what's out right now. We've got them all over the deck outside. They get bigger as the year goes on. This was taken in early August at my house. And then eventually we get to the great big ones in the fall. And this is what people typically see and notice. And I will say that the South Carolina Botanical Garden has some of the biggest Joros I have seen in the state. And trust me, I've seen a lot of them. Some of these things are absolutely massive. This is not a photoshopped picture in any way, shape, or form. This might be the biggest one I've seen. And there she is. And these are always going to be the females with the yellow and gray stripes. The males are tiny. They're about the diameter of a dime with their legs spread or so, little brown things, little nondescript things. Females are the great big ones that we see a lot. And a lot of what we do at Clemson Extension is help people figure out what's what and what do I need to deal with, right? We do have another big spider. We've got a couple of big yellow spiders that are similar to Joros. Banana spiders are the ones that are super common down in the coastal plain on the coast. These are the same genus, so they make great big webs. They've got the yellow strands. The big difference is the banana spiders don't have the stripes on their back. It's just all yellow with some dots, and they have fuzzy spots on their legs. Think of Olivia Newton-John from the 80s where she had her leg warmers. They're basically wearing fuzzy leg warmers, okay? So these are your banana spiders. We don't have to worry about them. They're just doing their thing. Garden spiders, kind of everywhere in the state. Those are also confused often with Joro spiders. These are the ones that make the little white thing going right down the middle. So we know that Joro spiders are spreading. So we've, first discovered around Athens, Georgia, and now they're kind of all over the place. A lot of science has happened. We've done the models to show that they are likely to be able to spread up and down the coast. Here is our current iNaturalist distribution. They're actually, iNaturalist is really good for tracking these things because it's pretty easy to identify them, especially as they get older. So big pulse around Georgia, South Carolina, Tennessee, North Carolina, and they see lots of spots kind of everywhere else. These also get inadvertently spread by humans, whether it's the egg sac getting taken or an adult, maybe on the bottom of a picnic table or something, they get spread around. When Joros first got here, there were some folks that said, hey, this is good news. Spiders eat things, right? These will eat things that are bad, that are detrimental. And I think, well, there's always some qualifications with something like this. And it really depends on your point of view. And this cartoon, to me, sums up how point of view matters, right? So you've got this little baby in the crib with the mobile, and you've got parents looking at it saying, oh, this is great. I love it. Cute. But this is what the baby sees, right? A bunch of circling butts, not nearly as cute as what the parents are going to see. And so this is kind of, I always think of this when I think of, well, are Joro spiders good? They eat everything, right? Yeah, they eat some bad stuff, but so do native spiders. And Joro spiders are basically doing two things. They're completely pushing out a lot of our native orb weavers everywhere they are. And this is just data to show that where there's Joros, they're the most abundant thing in it by far. Most native things are negatively affected when Joros come, meaning they displace populations. That was one of the characteristics we talked about earlier. For those that say Joros are going to eat, detrimental things, stink bugs and roaches, yeah, they will, but they'll eat anything. They're spiders, so they are completely non-discriminatory. They are just as likely to eat a brown marmorated stink bug or a spotted lanternfly as they are to eat a monarch butterfly or a honeybee, right? So spiders don't care. They will eat everything. And so that I think is an important point. It's not like they're coming in and going to specifically eat things we don't want. They'll just eat whatever falls in. We do work pretty close with the Georgia folks to try to track where these things are going, and it's a pretty effective program. Every year we'll do Joro Watch. So I hope when this comes, y'all take advantage and show us your sightings. Now, a quick Joro Q&A. Some things I'm asked all the time. Are they venomous? Question. The answer, yes, all spiders are venomous because that is what they use to subdue and kill their prey. The difference is Joro spider venom is not really that bad in terms of impactful to humans. Right? It's kind of like a mosquito bite if you get bitten by one. Will they get in the house? They will only get in the house if you bring them inside. Right? Joro spiders make big webs. Think of Charlotte from Charlotte's Web, where she would write Wilbur. They have to have a place where their web can spread out and air can go through there. That is not inside your house. Will they bite me or my pets? And they will if you really provoke them. So we've done a study where the only way we could get them to bite was by grabbing them and shoving them onto someone's hand, and then they would bite. But if you just touch them or run into their web, the first thing a spider is going to do, a Joro spider especially, going to drop and take off. It is not something we really need to worry about outside. All right, we've done all the inverts, but we are not done because there are also invasive vertebrates, which we do also have in South Carolina. Sadly, the tegu lizard is probably one of our most, well-known of the verts. These things get pretty beefy. They can get up to 4 feet long and 10 pounds or so. This is a good shot from Georgia. They also have them down here. These things have lots of characteristics that make them really, really good invaders, right? They're predatory and omnivorous, so they will hunt stuff or eat whatever's there. They can survive in a lot of different climates. They are aggressive. They can be aggressive. They're intelligent, relatively speaking. And right now we know they are established in Florida, Georgia, and they are documented. They have been documented kind of throughout South Carolina. We haven't seen any confirmed reproduction, but that's, who knows. So you may be asking, Dave, how did we get tegu lizards? Like, how did they just magically appear here? Well, like most things, it's from people, right? These things are pets. Here's a lady that's got one all snuggled up. Here's one chilling out on a couch, and here's one in a sweater. So people bring things in that probably shouldn't be there. And then when they get tired of them, they just put them outside because they think it's okay. And this is basically why tegu lizards are a problem in the Southeast. Not to mention, you can just go online and order them, right? So that's part of the problem, is a lot of this stuff is just widely available, especially online. There are regulations we're trying to work on. The SCDNR is doing all they can. Pets, current tegu pets are not illegal to have, but they should be registered in microchips. You can't get them anymore, but if you have one, it's kind of grandfathered in. But it's one of those things we're certainly keeping our eyes on. And finally, we'll go to wild hogs. Okay, and so these things have been a problem in the Southeast for long time. They are native to Eurasia. They were initially brought here, again, people, for food way back when. And of course, they escaped because hogs are super smart. Occasionally, they get intentionally released because people want to hunt them. And so there are farms that have, in the past, released these things. And this is how they've spread even up into Canada for some of the releases and that type of thing. Just a couple of shots to show you how these populations have expanded and spread. This is 1982. Purple is where they were. And here's where we are, a couple of years ago, basically all over the Southeast. In South Carolina, it is safe to assume that if you're in a bottomland hardwood, there are probably wild hogs somewhere there. They are found in all 46 counties. If you're a hunter, you can go ahead and take as many of these as you want. There's no limit whatsoever. Their impacts are incredibly detrimental. They will dig up lawns. They will dig up, when we've replanted in forestry tracts, they've gone through and just eaten all the new seedlings. We see damage in crops, especially where they'll just go and take all the corn or the beans or whatever. Fences get damaged, roads get damaged, golf courses get completely damaged. And these things are omnivores, right? So they'll even go after sea turtle eggs, which is a big no-no for a lot of things. So wild hogs have a lot of impacts. And one of the biggest problems with wild hogs is they're just so smart. It's really hard to eradicate them once they get into an area. It becomes more of a local management type of scenario. The invasive species program at Clemson, this is part of the regulatory group. There's a great website. I highly recommend y'all go check it out. And on there, for a lot of these pests, there are tabs where you can report if you think you've seen these things, right? If you think you've seen the yellow-legged hornet or an Asian longhorn beetle or what have you, there's some good reporting tools on there. And trust me, if you report that you have something, they will be in touch with you probably within 24 hours. And if it's a really urgent thing, they'll probably be out there within a day or so. So it's a really great group. We work closely with them. That said, I'm going to stop there. If anyone has questions, I am happy to take them. And the floor is wide open for anything you may have and want to ask.
Thank you so much, Dr. Coyle. That was an amazing presentation and super informative. So we'll go ahead and take questions from the chat box. And I got
What we got here?
scroll. So I have one. It says, are there natives that used to be non-native? And then is there a timeline like 100 years that non-natives can become a native if it's not doing any damage?
This is getting into a semantic academic argument. And so we all have our firm positions on this. My position is that something cannot become native if it is ever not native. Like you don't get to become a native. You're just always a non-native thing. You can become established, right? And then that's one of the things that happens. But if you're not native to a particular place, you will never be native to that place. And so that's just kind of where I've drawn the line. So certainly we have things that have naturalized, but you don't ever get to become native if you've not evolved there. I guess that's kind of my position on that.
And then I have another one. It says, do you think that the extensive drought affects the phloem invasive bugs?
Let's see, the drought. Drought typically doesn't affect invasive things because, especially in woody, well, a couple of reasons. Invasive things are pretty good at tolerating lots of different environments. So whether it's a rainy year or dry year, they don't really care. In terms of plant susceptibility to things, again, invasive things are primary, so they don't really care how healthy it is. They're going to get in there if they find that host acceptable. What drought does is really increase susceptibility of plants to our native things. And almost, especially for insects and pathogens, most native things we have are only going to stuff that's stressed, right? And so I deal a lot with trees. A lot of the tree pests we have, it's not southern pine beetle, which only affects pines, and that's the only native thing we have that really outbreaks. Everything else just comes with a stressed tree. So yes, when you have a drought, you have a lot of trees and woody things dying from all this other secondary stuff, but it's not necessarily making it more susceptible to invasive things because frankly, they don't care if it's a drought or not in the first place.
That makes sense. And then I have a couple people who someone asked, what about armadillos and what about stilt grass?
Yeah, I mean, armadillos are native, but boy, they are moving, right? So, and I didn't touch the armadillos, but yeah, their range is expanding. It would be the technical term. We're seeing them, more and more and more. And then stilt grass, yeah, I mean, there's only so much time. That's another bad one. Microstegium, you see that kind of all over the eastern part of the country at this point, especially in those bottomland, those lowland wet areas. And that makes it really hard to control because it's in a place that's almost always moist and the seeds get everywhere and they get caught in. And because it's in places that are moist like that, it's a lot of parks and recreation areas and the seeds are tiny. It's almost just like pepper. They get caught in bike treads, boot treads, hooves, animal paws, and all that. So it gets spread really, really easily. Stilt grass is another one of those that just, it's here. It can be eradicated and gotten rid of at a local scale, but it's really hard because you're by water all the time.
That makes sense. And that brings me to someone else's question is how do we struggle with these species? How do we work with getting these invasive species out?
Yeah, the best thing that we can do is report things that don't belong there, right, with the reporting tools, and we try to do the best we can to put information out about be on the lookout for this and that and the other. So report what do you think are there. Um, Once something is established, there's not a lot. If it's a plant, you can eradicate it on a local level, right? Because plants aren't just walking around. You can get rid of calorie pear in your land, for instance. Um, it's a lot harder to do that with insects and fungi. Plants, you can do it, but a lot of these invasive plants are either spread by wind or birds, and there's always going to be that stuff going in. So it's once something is here, it's like an ongoing battle, and it really comes down to what your tolerance is and ability, both physically and economically, to get rid of it. And that's kind of what it's a case by case thing, but it all starts with reporting it and keeping your eye out. And in this day and age, when I was a kid, if you reported something, someone had to physically drive out there and look at it. iPhone cameras are great. Like, you can send pictures into your local county extension agent, and a lot of things get ID'd just with a couple clicks. And so that's a really good first step, honestly.
Do y'all use iNaturalist to track these kind of things at all?
You should. Yeah, iNaturalist is great. It's super helpful, and there's ways to put good images in there that scientists can use. We actually use iNaturalist to make those Joro spider potential distribution maps because they're so good. So
that's really cool.
Yeah.
And somebody asked, if you see a swarm of lanternflies, what should you do?
First thing you should do is report it. So we know where it is. We being, Clemson Regulatory, right? There's that reporting tool on the website. Second thing, if you can catch a few, put them in a Ziploc bag, shove them in the freezer for when the regulatory folks come out there to double check them. And then I recommend killing them, however you feel comfortable doing so. And if you don't, regulatory might be able to help with that.
And then, Pam asked if there's slides or information provided later. Pam, yes, we are recording the webinar and we'll be putting it up on our South Carolina Wildlife Federation YouTube channel.
I see a question on the Bradford Pear Bounty. Yes, that is still happening. Next year, we have locations in 4 areas, and I'm not going to say them because we're not fully confirmed yet, but we've got a webpage that I can put in the chat to show you all where that is. But yes, that program is probably going on for a while.
And then Bill, cormorants are not invasive.
Correct.
And then I have our stink bugs on a top 10 bad guys list for South Carolina.
Probably. Admittedly, that's an ag pest, and I don't do a lot of it. But yeah, well, there's a lot of native stink bugs, though, so careful there. But if you're looking at the brown marmorated stink bug, I think that's a lot of people's, on the list of a lot of people. So we do have native stink bugs, though, and they're usually the big greenish ones. They're a little bigger than the brown marmorated, so they are certainly a pest for sure. And I put the Bradford Pear Bounty website in the thing there. Oh, that was the host and panelists, so I'm going to put it to everybody. Oop, everyone. There it is to everybody.
And then someone asked, how can we stop invasive plants from being bought and sold on the internet?
I don't know. If somebody does know, I would love to know how. And from a regulatory perspective, and I say this, so my position at Clemson is mostly extension. There's a lot of research too, but I work really closely with our regulatory group to try to help stop these problems before they start. Online purchasing of things is kind of like the Wild West in that there's no really good way to police it. Just because there just isn't a good way to police it, and there's no good way to inspect every individual package that gets sent to wherever, South Carolina, right? Honestly, the best thing you can do is encourage people to not buy non-native stuff, right? Buy native plants. And, I've always made the argument that for every, I think non-native plants, especially in a managed landscape, right? People like their non-native plants because of a couple things. They're either really pretty in the spring, they're really pretty in the fall, and they're practically impossible to kill, right? It's one of those three things, if not a couple of them. For every one of those characteristics, there are native trees and shrubs that check all those boxes. It's just that they take a little more, they're not obviously there. They're not going to be available at Lowe's and Home Depot. You got to do a little more digging to find them. You got to do a little more research to figure out what they are. But for every characteristic a non-native tree or shrub has, there's native ones that look just as awesome and will do just as great. And that's the challenge, I think, is trying to get that information out to people, because a lot of folks, maybe not people on this webinar because you're here because of an interest, right? But a lot of people in wherever, they just see something pretty down the road and think, I want one of those. And the next thing you know is Bradford pear in there, right? So it's one of those things where we just try to educate people as to there's lots of good native options out there. And that's kind of where we are right now in terms of, policing the stuff on the internet. I don't know that anyone has any clue how we're going to effectively do that.
And then Melissa asked, this is kind of a follow-up question to that. Is there a way to determine what actually is native for this area and where has trusted information?
Peer-reviewed literature, number one. Herbariums, number two. Government agencies like, DNR, Clemson Extension, we've got all that stuff too. The Forest Service in some cases. Native plant societies are pretty good about all those things too. So there are some really good, reputable organizations. I would say go to a reputable organization and you're going to be good to go. Start with your county extension agent. A lot of times the horticulture agent knows a lot of this stuff, or they're pretty educated on a lot of those things too. Mm-hmm. I see another one from Janet. If an invasive species is identified in a shipment, such as in a pallet, what happens with the shipment? Typically, the whole thing is sent out, like not coming into the country. So that's typically what happens. Yep. And how they inspect and all that, that's probably a whole nother hour's worth of talking. But long story short, if they find it before it's unloaded, like because they inspect stuff at the docks and everything. If they open up the big containers and there's evidence of insect or pest infestation in there, shut, sent out. If it's found, after the container's unloaded, like this pallet is contaminated, well, the whole pallet is going to get destroyed. So it's basically zero tolerance in whatever container size of stuff that they have found the thing in. Either whole container or whole pallet is typically not allowed in or destroyed if it's already in.
Wow, that's amazing. I didn't know that. It's really cool.
Yeah, it's a big deal to find something in there like that. So
awesome. Well, that's about time, and I don't see any more questions, and I don't think I missed anyone, hopefully, in the chat. But this, I know I mentioned it, but this is recorded, and we'll put it on our YouTube channel, and we'll also post it on our social media as well. But yeah.
Last question I see, Beth. Is it more expensive to plant natives in your yard? I would argue it is not. And I'm pretty adamant about doing natives in my yard. I don't think it's more expensive, but it takes a little more effort to find the stuff. Like I said, you can't just go to a big box store and find something often. You can't just go to a big box store and find something cool because they've got all the usual stuff that everyone's got. But if you do a little work, a lot of the smaller nurseries are going to have stuff. Any nursery that's focused on native plants, there's a good one at Aiken that's like all native things. And we've got a smaller one in the town I live in that's got some good native stuff. But it just takes a little more effort on the front end. It's not really that much more expensive to buy something of a similar size. It's just that you have to find it. And that sometimes can be a little bit more, but not always, right? Sometimes some of those big box stores will have native stuff. So it just depends on what you're after. Oh,
Perfect.
there's a list of vendors from the SCMPS right there.
Perfect. And then I think somebody asked if, for the last question, if this can be used as, somebody said, can we get a pesticide license CEUs from this webinar?
No, that had to be done on the way from that.
Okay.
I don't know that they do a lot for webinars either. South Carolina typically does a lot of in-person stuff. Maybe though, it's something that, but that's a on the front end.
Awesome.
Mhm.
About time. Thank you so much, Dr. Coyle, for being with us. Thanks everybody for joining us today. I hope everybody has a great rest of their afternoon.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Yep.